Welcome. We are embarking on a really, a rather ambitious mission today, and it's curated specifically for you.
It really is a formidable topic. I mean, to
Uh-huh.
do it justice, we are moving way beyond the standard textbook summaries.
Right. The goal today is to unpack one of the most intricate, highly integrated, and, occasionally baffling systems in the known universe.
The neuroscience of decision-making and emotion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have a pretty substantial stack of cutting-edge neuroscience literature sitting right in front of us.
Oh, yeah, a massive stack.
We are pulling from foundational theories established back in 2001 all the way through to these incredible breakthroughs from 2024 and 2025.
Papers published in premier journals, too. I'm talking Nature, Neuron, Cerebral Cortex, and Neuropsychopharmacology.
And the reason we are doing this deep dive is to look intimately at structural changes, network connectivity, and the regional activation of the brain.
Which is really the only way to genuinely understand the system, because the brain does not make decisions in a vacuum.
No.
Nor does it operate as a collection of isolated anatomical islands.
So true. And the central mystery we are attempting to solve for you today is actually highly practical.
It's something everyone experiences.
Right. Think about when you are in the heat of an emotional moment. Perhaps you've just been deeply insulted, or you're overwhelmed by sudden frustration.
Your blood is boiling.
Yeah. Does it actually biologically help to delay your response? We've always heard that colloquial advice, right? Like, hold your horses.
Or count to 10.
Exactly. Count to 10. We want to know if there is empirical neurobiological proof that pausing actually allows the rational brain to catch up with the emotional brain.
What's fascinating here is that to properly answer that question, we have to discard the classical, almost phrenological idea of the brain.
Meaning the old idea of, this part does X and that part does Y.
Precisely. We cannot look at brain regions as isolated blobs where one specific part does exactly one specific thing.
Right.
Instead, we have to understand the brain as a landscape of highly dynamic, flexible networks that are constantly reconfiguring themselves based on the immediate demands of your environment.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how those networks reconfigure during an emotional spike, we need to understand the architectural foundation of cognitive control itself.
Which would be the prefrontal cortex.
TFC, right.
The prefrontal cortex is the biological anchor for what we call executive function. And a really logical starting point for this is a highly influential 2001 paper by Ul K. Miller and Jonathan D. Cohen.
Oh, I know this one. It was published in the Annual Review of Neuroscience.
Yes, titled An Integrative Theory of Prefrontal Cortex Function.
Right. And in that paper, Miller and Cohen introduced this overarching concept of the PFC as the ultimate coordinator.
They did.
And they framed it around a fundamental computational problem that every human faces constantly, which they termed indeterminacy.
Indeterminacy is a vital concept to grasp. It essentially describes the burden of choice.
The burden of choice.
Yeah. At any given second, you have a staggering multitude of action options available to you.
Like if your phone rings on your desk.
Perfect example. The sensory input, the sound of the ring, does not strictly determine your behavioral response.
Because I could answer it, or I could just stare at it.
Or you could throw the device across the room. You could start singing.
Right. I mean, if we were looking at a much simpler organism, a specific sensory stimulus might trigger an automatic hardwired motor response.
But human cognition does not work that way. The sensory input creates a massive competition among various neural pathways.
So how does the brain resolve that competition without paralyzing us in a state of constant indecision?
That is where the prefrontal cortex intervenes. It takes those lower-level sensory and motor processes and aligns them with an internal goal.
So it's playing favorites.
In a way, yes. The PFC effectively biases the competition. Say your internal goal is to maintain a quiet environment because you are in a library.
Okay.
The PFC sends signals that strengthen the neural pathways associated with reaching out and silencing the phone.
While actively suppressing the pathways associated with answering it and speaking loudly.
Exactly. So it isn't necessarily that the PFC is doing the physical action.
Right. It's rather that it is the conductor ensuring the right sections of the orchestra are playing at the right volume to achieve a specific piece of music.
A great analogy. But our understanding of how that conduction happens has shifted massively since 2001.
We are no longer looking at the PFC as just a regional conductor.
No, we have moved firmly into the realm of network neuroscience.
And this shift is beautifully detailed in the work of Nico Dosenbach and his colleagues.
Yes, in a 2007 paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences titled A Dual Networks Architecture of Top-Down Control.
They began to map out how the brain learns and adapts by utilizing distinct interconnected systems rather than isolated regions.
Right. And to really visualize how these networks are structured physically in the brain, we should look at graph theory.
Graph theory. Oh, wait, you're talking about the 2021 paper by Suzanne and Haber.
Yes. Prefrontal connectomics, from anatomy to human imaging, published in Neuropsychopharmacology.
She uses a concept called small world networks.
And she compares the brain's white matter tracks to an airline network.
The airline analogy is incredibly robust for understanding brain efficiency.
It really is. In graph theory, you analyze networks by looking at nodes, which would be specific brain regions, and edges, which are the physical connections between them.
And a small world network is characterized by having a high degree of local clustering, but very short path lengths across the entire system.
Right, and Haber describes this using what she calls provincial hubs and connector hubs.
So a provincial hub would be like a local airport in a mid-sized city.
Exactly. It handles a massive density of local flights. In the brain, these are local clusters of neurons doing highly specific, dense, specialized processing.
Like analyzing the specific pitch of a sound.
Or the edge of a visual shape.
Huh.
But you cannot build an efficient global airline simply by connecting every small airport to every other small airport.
The infrastructure cost would be impossible. You would literally run out of physical space for the wiring in the skull.
Precisely the issue. So the brain uses connector hubs.
These are the JFKs and health rows of the neural network.
Yes. They handle long-range intermodule communication. They take the processed information from a local cluster and zip it across the brain to another major hub.
This small world architecture allows the brain to be both highly specialized, locally and globally integrated, without requiring an infinite amount of white matter.
So applying that network architecture back to cognitive control, Dosenbach's 2007 work and the subsequent updates mapped out in a 2024 retrospective paper by Dosenbach and Rachel identified that this top-down control relies on a dual network architecture.
The brain is essentially running two separate management systems that operate on entirely different timescales.
And the distinction in timescales is the critical takeaway here.
Let's break those down.
The first system is the frontoparietal network. This is your rapid response control system.
Rapid response.
Yes, it is designed to initiate control and adjust it on a millisecond by millisecond, trial by trial basis.
So when a piece of novel information enters your environment or an immediate rule suddenly changes.
The frontoparietal network pivots your attention.
Okay, and parallel to that, you have the cingulo-opercular network.
Right, and the cingulo-opercular network operates on a much longer time scale. It is responsible for what they call set maintenance.
Set maintenance.
It acts as a background action mode network, providing stable control over entire task epochs.
Meaning it holds the overarching goal steady, regardless of the granular rapid adjustments happening locally.
Yes.
Let's ground this in a scenario for you, the listener. Imagine you're sitting in a highly complex, slightly tense strategy meeting.
Okay, good scenario.
You are reviewing financial projections on a screen, your colleague keeps clearing their throat, and you occasionally have to jot down a note.
Your frontoparietal network is constantly shifting your immediate focus.
Right. It processes the number on the screen, then actively suppresses the distraction of the throat clearing, then guides your hand to write the note.
It is constantly tweaking the local parameters.
But while all of that micro-adjustment is happening, your cingulo-opercular network is serving as the anchor.
It is maintaining the overall set of the environment.
Like, I am in a professional setting, I am evaluating quarterly financials, I must maintain a collaborative posture.
Exactly. Now, what do you think happens if one of those networks is impaired? Say, through fatigue or a neurological deficit?
Well, if your frontoparietal network is suppressed, you become rigid.
You do. You might stare at the spreadsheet, but fail to process a sudden question from your boss because you cannot rapidly pivot your cognitive resources.
Conversely, if your cingulo-opercular network falters, you lose the overarching goal.
You become entirely reactive to the environment.
You might answer an unrelated email on your phone, then stare out the window, completely forgetting the broader context of the strategy meeting.
Cognitive control requires the friction and balance between rapid flexibility and long-term stability.
That structural balance sets up a deeper anatomical question. How does the prefrontal cortex physically organize these different levels of abstraction?
Now we are moving from the concept of networks into the physical geography of the frontal lobe.
Specifically looking at the posterior to anterior axis.
The spatial organization of cognitive control is one of the most elegant discoveries in modern neuroscience.
And we can trace this through a foundational 2007 paper by David Baudry and Mark Desposito,
titled Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging Evidence for a Hierarchical Organization of the Prefrontal Cortex.
which was further refined in a 2016 eLife paper by Desposito and Derek Nee.
They demonstrated that the lateral prefrontal cortex, the LPFC, is organized hierarchically from the back of the frontal lobe toward the front.
They identified an abstraction gradient.
Right. The rear part, the posterior LPFC, closer to your motor cortex, handles immediate, concrete sensory situations.
But as you move physically forward toward your forehead into the anterior regions, the processing becomes increasingly abstract.
And decoupled from immediate sensory input.
Let's give an example. The posterior regions are dealing with direct sensor motor mapping.
For example, if I see a red light, I press the brake pedal with my foot.
It is a direct translation of a physical stimulus to a physical action.
But as you move forward to the mid-lateral prefrontal cortex, the regions begin acting as synthesizers.
They receive input from those concrete posterior regions, but they also incorporate contextual rules.
Contextual rules like, if I see a red light, I press the brake pedal, unless I am driving an ambulance with the sirens on.
Oh, okay.
The mid-LPFC holds that contextual rule and overrides the simple sensoromotor mapping of the posterior LPFC.
And then as you move to the absolute front of this anatomical hierarchy, you reach the top-level manager,
The frontal polar cortex.
the FPC. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Because the FPC sits at the very peak of this hierarchy.
We're looking at a 2022 paper by Jeremy Hoogeveen titled, What Does the Frontopolar Cortex Do?
He dives into the FPC's role in something called retrospective monitoring.
Retrospective monitoring is a fascinating computational function. The FPC does not just evaluate the goals you are currently pursuing or the actions you just took.
No, it heavily tracks the value of unchosen or counterfactual options.
So it is constantly calculating the mathematical value of the paths we walked away from.
It has to, because humans are constantly faced with the explore-exploit dilemma.
Explore versus exploit.
Do you exploit a known resource, say a specific strategy at work that you know yields a reliable, moderate result? Or do you explore a new, untested strategy that might yield a massive reward, but carries the significant risk of yielding nothing?
How does the FPC actually calculate that mathematically? Does it use a form of Bayesian updating?
It relies heavily on reward prediction errors.
Okay, break that down for us.
When you choose to exploit a known option, let's say you go to your favorite restaurant and order the exact same meal you always get.
Easy choice.
Your mid-LPFC is managing the immediate execution of that goal. But your FPC is scanning the environment.
Scanning for what?
If you see another patron receive a new dish that looks spectacular, your FPC calculates a counterfactual prediction error.
Wow.
It updates the internal valuation model of that unchosen dish, essentially banking that data.
So it is shaping the abstract policy for the next time you enter that restaurant, even while you are currently eating something else.
Exactly. And this top-level overarching control system is not a single unified entity.
Our understanding of the FPC was significantly complicated in a good way by a 2018 PNAS paper by Matthew Dixon and colleagues.
The paper is titled Heterogeneity Within the Frontoparietal Control Network and Its Relationship to the Default and Dorsal Attention Networks.
Dixon's team discovered that this overarching control network is actually bifurcated into two distinct subsystems,
FPCNA and FPCNB.
This split redefined how we think about where the brain directs its managerial oversight.
Dixon demonstrated that FPCNA exhibits strong functional connectivity with the default mode network.
The default network is the brain's primary system for internally directed cognition, right?
Mind wandering, mental time travel, autobiographical memory, and metacognitive awareness of your own emotional state.
FPCNA acts as the internal regulator. It provides cognitive control over your own introspective processes.
So if you are ruminating on a past argument and trying to rationally process your feelings about it, FPCNA is the network managing that internal data.
Conversely, FPCNB aligns heavily with the dorsal attention network.
And this network is dedicated entirely to the external world.
It regulates visuospatial perception and directs your attention during physical sensory-motor interactions with the environment.
So if FPCNA is managing your internal emotional reflections, FBCNB is the manager actively guiding your attention when you are navigating a busy intersection.
Or playing a fast-paced sport. You literally have two wings of top-level cognitive control, one facing inward to manage the self, and one facing outward to manage the physical world.
And this bifurcation is the perfect bridge to understanding how the brain handles emotional interference.
Because until now, we have largely been discussing cool cognitive control.
We are pulling this concept from a 2022 neuropsychopharmacology review by Naomi Friedman and Trevor Robbins,
Titled, The Role of Prefrontal Cortex in Cognitive Control and Executive Function.
They make a stark distinction between cool and hot cognitive control.
Cool cognitive control involves abstract, rule-based, emotionally neutral tasks.
If a researcher puts you in an fMRI machine and asks you to memorize a sequence of numbers or sort visual shapes by color, you are utilizing cool control.
There is no significant emotional stake in the outcome.
But human behavior is rarely driven by cool, abstract rules.
We are driven by motivation, by social pressure, by significant rewards, and by fear.
That requires hot cognitive control.
Hot cognitive control is how you manage your behavior when the outcome has a profound emotional or motivational valence.
And to understand how the brain exerts control in these scenarios, we have to look at the regions that assign value to the world.
The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, and the orbital frontal cortex, the OFC.
Historically, neuroscientists sometimes frame these valuation regions as simple cash registers.
The idea was that the VMPFC just slapped a numerical price tag on everything you encountered.
But recent computational models have completely upended that.
We are looking at Luca Monetta's 2024 paper, Representational Spaces in Orbitofrontal and Ventromedial Prefrontal Cortex,
Alongside Edmund Roll's 2022 cerebral cortex paper on effective connectonics.
Monetta's 2024 paper is particularly revealing because it highlights that the VMPFC and OFC do not calculate a simple linear scalar number for value.
They map internal biological states, sensory observations, and prior knowledge into incredibly high-dimensional representational spaces.
How does a single neuron handle that much dimensional complexity?
Moneta details a phenomenon called mixed selectivity.
Mixed selectivity.
In older, more localized models of the brain, the assumption was often that a specific neuron might fire exclusively to represent a single variable.
Say, the presence of a specific reward, like water.
Right. But mixed selectivity means that a single neuron in the OFC is multiplexing.
It might fire to encode the specific flavor of the water, the statistical probability that the water will be delivered, and your current homeostatic level of thirst all simultaneously.
Moneta even compares the encoding in these regions to the late layers of deep reinforcement learning AI models.
The value of a glass of water is not a static number in the brain's database.
The VMPFC and OFC are constantly updating its value based on context.
If you just finished a 10-mile run, that representational space shifts dramatically, and the water is encoded with immense value.
But if you just drank a liter of water, the same neurons shift their firing patterns, and the value approaches zero.
It is a dynamic state representation.
And what makes the VMPFC even more remarkable is that it does not just calculate these values for your own selfish homeostatic needs.
It is heavily implicated in social valuation.
This brings us to one of the most compelling papers in our stack, a 2024 Nature paper by Patricia Lockwood and colleagues.
Titled, Human Ventromedial Prefrontal Cortex is Necessary for Pro-Social Motivation.
This paper is a landmark because it moves beyond mere correlation, which is often the limit of fMRI studies, and provides causal evidence for how the VMPFC drives behavior.
To establish causality, Lockwood's team studied a very specific cohort of patients.
These were individuals with localized lesions, actual physical, neurological damage, specifically isolated to the VMPFC.
They wanted to test how this damage affected effort discounting.
Effort discounting is an economic and psychological principle.
It simply means that the more physical or mental effort a task requires, the less valuable the subsequent reward appears to be.
Most healthy individuals show a standard discounting curve.
You might be willing to walk 1 block for a free coffee, but you probably will not walk 3 miles for one.
But Lockwood specifically tested pro-social effort discounting.
How much effort are you willing to expend when the reward goes to someone else?
Right.
What was the actual physical task they used to measure this?
The researchers typically use a physical dynamometer.
A dynamometer.
Yes, a hand grip device that measures precisely how much physical force a participant is exerting.
Okay.
The participants are given a choice. They can choose a baseline option that requires minimal grip force for a small monetary reward.
Or they can choose an effortful option that requires squeezing the dynamometer at a high percentage of their maximum physical strength for a larger monetary reward.
And the critical variable is who gets the money.
Sometimes the participant keeps the money, and sometimes the money goes to an anonymous other person.
Exactly the setup. In healthy control subjects, the results are predictable.
People are generally willing to exert significant physical force to earn money for themselves.
And they're also willing to exert force for others, though the pre-social discounting curve is slightly steeper.
We are a bit lazier when the reward isn't ours.
True. But the patients with VMPFC lesions showed a profound specific deficit.
Their ability to squeeze the dynamometer was physically intact.
Their comprehension of the math and the rules of the task was intact.
When the reward was for themselves, their effort discounting curve looked relatively normal.
But when the reward was for someone else, their willingness to exert effort collapsed.
So the VMPFC is a causal, necessary biological hub for pro-social behavior.
It is the literal machinery that performs the complex calculus of cost to me versus benefit to you.
Without an intact VMPFC, that specific altruistic calculation breaks down.
It illustrates perfectly how deeply embedded our social structures, our emotional valuations, and our physical effort are within these prefrontal networks.
They are inextricably linked.
Yes.
So let's synthesize this. We have this vast architecture. We have the frontoparietal network making rapid adjustments, this cingulo-opercular network maintaining overarching goal.
We have the frontopolar cortex managing abstract internal and external oversight.
And we have the VMPFC assigning high-dimensional value to everything we encounter.
Which brings us directly to the core mystery we posed at the beginning.
So what does this all mean? When an emotional event occurs, when the amygdala detects a threat or a severe insult, these systems collide.
Does taking a pause, does holding your horses actually allow the cognitive control networks to catch up and regulate the emotion?
The definitive answer from the literature is yes. And the mechanics of how this pause functions biologically is extraordinary.
Let's trace the exact pathway of this delay.
To map the computation of this delay, we rely heavily on Amitai Shenhav and colleagues' 2013 Neuron paper.
The expected value of control.
It is a highly influential computational model that centers on a specific region called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC.
In Shenhav's model, the DACC acts as an incredibly sophisticated conflict detector.
Imagine a scenario. You are driving home, you are already stressed from work, and another driver aggressively cuts you off, nearly causing an accident.
In a fraction of a millisecond, your amygdala detects a severe threat and initiates an automatic, deeply ingrained sympathetic nervous system response.
It prepares your body for fight or flight.
Your heart rate spikes, and the immediate prepotent urge is to lay on the horn, accelerate, and yell at the other driver.
But you have competing goals. Your cingulo-opercular network is maintaining the goal of getting home safely.
And your FPCNA might be managing the internal goal of, I am trying to be a calmer, less reactive person.
This creates a massive neural conflict.
The DACC detects this conflict between the automatic emotional response driven by the amygdala and your higher-order goal-directed plans.
And it immediately begins calculating the expected value of control, or EVC.
How does the DACC calculate the cost of control before the control is even applied?
It relies on previous state representations.
The EVC integrates three variables: the expected payoff of achieving the higher-order goal, getting home safely;
the amount of cognitive control that will be required to suppress the amygdala, which is biologically expensive;
and the probability that applying this control will actually succeed.
If the conflict is too high or the person is utterly exhausted, the DACC might calculate that the cost of control is higher than the expected value.
And it simply lets the amygdala take over. You yell at the driver.
But if the DACC calculates that control is worth the effort, it sends an urgent signaling cascade to the lateral prefrontal cortex
to step in and apply top-down inhibition.
And here's the absolute crux of the matter, drawing on Michael Frank's 2006 computational model, literally titled "Hold Your Horses."
This top-down control isn't instantaneous.
It takes physical time. Frank's model demonstrated that when the DACC detects high-decision conflict, the brain relies on specific anatomical pathways,
particularly involving the subthalamic nucleus,
to actively inhibit premature motor responding.
The subthalamic nucleus essentially acts as a global brake on the motor system.
It freezes you. It is the biological pause.
Yes. The subthalamic nucleus holds your horses.
This physical delay provides the necessary temporal window for the electrical signals from the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the lateral prefrontal cortex to travel down.
and exert top-down inhibitory control over the amygdala. The 2022 Friedman and Robbins review highlights this exact dynamic.
If you react immediately within the first few hundred milliseconds of the stimulus, you are acting purely on the amygdala's automatic output.
The prefrontal cortex simply has not had the physical time required for its action potentials to travel down the white matter tracks and apply the brakes.
Counting to 10 is a biological necessity. You are buying time for the speed of neural transmission.
But it isn't just about electricity traveling down a wire. The environment inside the brain during this pause is heavily modulated by chemistry.
We look at the 2024 Brain Sciences paper by Neil Boyle and colleagues.
Monomonergic modulation of learning and cognitive function in the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex is continuously bathed in neuromodulators.
During this delay, when the subthalamic nucleus has hit the brakes, neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin are actively flooding the synaptic clefts in the PFC.
Dopamine is so frequently misunderstood purely as a reward chemical. What is it actually doing mechanically in the prefrontal cortex during this moment of high conflict?
Boyle's paper details how dopamine binds to different families of receptors, specifically D1-like and D2-like receptors.
In the PFC, dopamine does not just signal reward, it modulates the signal-to-noise ratio of the neurons.
Signal-to-noise ratio, like tuning a radio dial to get rid of static.
A very apt analogy. When you are cut off in traffic, there is massive neural noise, the adrenaline, the fear, the anger.
When dopamine binds to D1 receptors on the dendrites in the PFC, it physically alters the resting membrane potential of those neurons.
It enhances the signal, which are the strong, goal-relevant representations of wanting to get home safely.
While simultaneously suppressing the spontaneous firing of irrelevant distractions, the noise.
And serotonin is operating in parallel.
Serotonin acts to fine-tune the balance between emotional reactivity and cognitive control, often promoting behavioral flexibility and patience.
So when you hold your horses, you are not merely waiting. You are allowing dopamine and serotonin the physical time to alter the electrical excitability of your prefrontal cortex.
Boosting the signal of your long-term goals so they can overpower the immediate static of your rage.
What happens when this system fails? Because we all know that even with the best intentions, sometimes we don't hold our horses.
We snap. We send the reactive email. We yell at the other driver.
When cognitive control fails, the brain shifts from regulation into iteration. It has to learn from the failure.
This is beautifully outlined in a 2024 Nature paper by Chen and colleagues.
Titled, Anterior Cingulate Cortex provides the neural substrates for feedback-driven iteration of decision and value representation.
So you fail to regulate and you yield to the amygdala. The outcome is usually negative.
You feel terrible or you cause a secondary conflict. How does the brain process that aftermath?
The anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, evaluates the negative outcome of your reactive choice.
It generates a massive prediction error.
A mathematical difference between what the amygdala promised, yelling will make me feel better, and reality, yelling made everything worse.
Exactly. The ACC takes that error signal and uses it to iteratively update the internal models in your VMPFC and FPC.
It physically rewires the synaptic weights of those valuations.
The next time you face a similar emotional trigger, the internal cost of the bad behavior is weighted significantly higher in the expected value of control calculation.
The ACC ensures that the failure makes the brakes easier to apply next time.
But what if a person's neurobiology struggles to apply those brakes consistently?
This is not just an abstract computational theory. It has profound implications for clinical psychiatry.
We can examine a 2019 F1000 research paper by Alec Widge and colleagues titled Prefrontal Cortex and Cognitive Control.
They looked at the quantitative psychiatric outcomes when these specific networks exhibit deficits.
Widge's paper utilized laboratory tests like the Gonna-Go task. Can you explain how that measures this specific failure of inhibition?
A Gonna-Go task is a classic psychomotor test. A participant is told to press a button as quickly as possible every time they see a green square on a screen.
This builds up a prepotent motor response. They get used to rapidly hitting the button.
But they are told that if a red square appears, they must not press the button.
They have to abruptly hold their horses.
Precisely. Widge's paper highlights that a patient's error rate on these specific no-go trials, their inability to inhibit a prepotent response strongly and quantitatively, predicts specific psychiatric symptom clusters.
It correlates highly with perseveration, compulsion, substance use disorders, and severe mood and anxiety dysregulation.
Because if your lateral prefrontal cortex struggles to send that inhibitory signal in a sterile laboratory setting regarding a red square,
It is going to severely struggle to send an inhibitory signal to the amygdala during a massive anxiety spike in the real world.
if we connect this to the bigger picture, this mechanistic understanding is the foundation for modern therapeutic interventions.
When a clinician utilizes cognitive behavioral therapy or targeted neurostimulation techniques like TMS, they are not just talking about feelings.
They're actively attempting to restore the functional connectivity of cognitive control,
They are trying to strengthen the anatomical edges between the FPCNA, that internal managerial network, and the default mode network.
helping patients regain the biological capacity to regulate their internal emotional state.
So what does this highly technical neurobiological deep dive mean for you, the listener, navigating your actual life?
The next time you are thrust into a high-emotion scenario, a confrontational meeting, a sudden craving, or a spike of anxiety, I want you to reflect on the immense computational machinery running beneath your skull.
Recognizing the biology of the system can be incredibly empowering.
Taking a deep breath or choosing to walk away for 10 minutes is not a sign of passive avoidance or weakness.
It is a highly optimized neurobiological strategy.
You are actively providing the physical temporal window required for your subthalamic nucleus to pause motor action.
You are giving your DACC the milliseconds it needs to calculate the expected value of control.
You are allowing dopamine to bind to the D1 receptors to boost the signal-to-noise ratio in your prefrontal cortex.
You are literally waiting for the electrical signals to travel from the front of your brain down to your amygdala to lower the volume.
You are giving the biological CEO of your brain the physical time it needs to review the contract before the amygdala forces you to sign it.
Let's recap this journey. We began with the foundational realization that the prefrontal cortex exists to overcome the indeterminacy of human choice.
We mapped the brain's small world airline network, where the frontoparietal system makes rapid adjustments while the cinguloopercular system maintains the long-term goal.
We traced the physical hierarchy of thought along the anterior-posterior axis, arriving at the frontopolar cortex, which utilizes retrospective monitoring to evaluate the paths we choose not to take.
We explored how the VMPFC and OFC act as high-dimensional representational spaces, assigning dynamic value to our environment.
And we looked at the causal proof from Lockwood's dynamometer studies showing that the VMPFC is absolutely necessary for pro-social altruistic effort.
Finally, we verified the biological truth of holding your horses.
We mapped the conflict detection of the DACC, the motor inhibition of the subthalamic nucleus, and the iterative learning process managed by the ACC when control fails.
It is a staggering, beautiful system of friction and balance.
But before we conclude, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over, returning to the AI comparison mentioned in Moneta's 2024 paper.
This raises an important question. We noted that Moneta compares the representational spaces in our VMPFC to the architecture of deep reinforcement learning.
However, our highly advanced, flexible human cognition relies entirely on the biological friction between these dual systems.
We rely on the friction between the hot, messy, highly subjective emotional evaluations in the VMPFC and the cool, calculating, inhibitory cognitive control in the LPFC.
We require the conflict, and we require the physical pause to resolve it.
As we continue to build increasingly advanced artificial intelligence systems, will AI ever be able to truly replicate human decision-making?
Or is genuine, human-like intelligence fundamentally impossible without an architecture that purposefully simulates emotional interference, irrational valuations, and the absolute necessity of taking a pause to let a rational subsystem override an emotional one?
Can you construct human intelligence without simulating the human struggle for control?
It is a philosophical and computational question that both neuroscience and computer science will be grappling with for the foreseeable future.
It's certainly something for you to ponder the next time you hold your horses.
Thank you for joining us on this highly detailed deep dive. Keep exploring the neurobiology of your own choices, keep giving your prefrontal cortex the temporal window it requires, and above all, stay insanely curious.